This is a 2000 Porsche 911, and it is a lovely car. Not in the Porsche world, of course, where Porsche purists decry it because it isn't air-cooled anymore and the headlights look a little funny and blah, blah, blah. Well, I love it. I think this is a great driving car and a bargain to buy. And today I'm going to review the 996 911 and give you my take, and I'll show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this 996 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This 911 is finished in an interesting color, this rainforest green metallic. It has a manual transmission and it's offered with no reserve. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this 911 where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right. Time for the quirks and features of the 996 Porsche 911, starting with the basics. So, the original Porsche 911 came out back in the 1960s, and it remained on the market for decades. In fact, every Porsche 911 sold all the way through 1998, almost 35 years after the original came out, was just a variation of the original 911. Now, obviously, there were updates and changes and improvements and new models and new looks along the way, but the 911 at its core remained pretty much a variation of the same car for those 30 plus years until 1999. And that's when the 996 came out, the first completely, fully ground up redesigned 911 ever since the brand new model had first gone on sale. As you can imagine, this created some controversy, and this car sparked some criticism. Now, I personally think the 996 was doomed to be criticized pretty much regardless of what Porsche did with it, just because it was finally changing this beloved car that had become such an icon in the automotive world, in the sports car world. The 996 had to follow up on this very impressive act, and it was always going to be hard. But there are some pointed criticisms of this car that people always mention, and the biggest is undoubtedly the headlight design. Up until this car, the headlights on 911 models had always been circular or maybe a little bit oval, but here the headlight was incorporated into this kind of larger panel that included this other light, the headlight washers, the turn signal, and it changed the look of the front end design of the 911, which had been so similar for so many years. In fact, the early 996 models actually had an orange front turn signal, and so a lot of people called it the runny egg headlight because it looked like the orange turn signal was the yoke and the rest of it was sort of running like on a frying pan. That's how people referred to this car. That was a 996 criticism, and there were more. Another was the engine situation. This car uses a flat six, just like previous 911 models basically always had, but with the 996, Porsche switched from air-cooled engines to water-cooled engines. Now, water cooling was obviously the technology that was more advanced, more improved, but 911 people, they enjoy the old school, the analog, the basic, and the sound that comes from an air-cooled powertrain. And so this car, switching to headlights, switching to water-cooled, it was chaos, it was anarchy. And it was made even worse by the arrival of the Boxster. This car debuted basically alongside the 986 Porsche Boxster. The Boxster actually came out a couple years earlier, but the cars were co-developed, and as a result, they shared a lot of parts. In fact, the entire front end of the 996 911 and the Boxster, the hood, the front panels, everything in the front was shared between the two cars. And a lot of the interior was shared too, including most of the dashboard. And for 911 people, this felt a little like sacrilege, that the 911 would be kind of dumbed down and cheapened by sharing so many parts with the base model. Previous 911s had never shared stuff with the 944 or the 968, for example. They were totally distinct. And here was Porsche trying to basically get two cars out of one. And that didn't sit right with Porsche enthusiasts either. The 911 was supposed to be the flagship, and they didn't love that decision. Nor did they love the general look of the interior interior, which has some more plastic, some kind of cheaper bits than what you would have found in previous 911 interiors. But despite all the complaints, the simple truth was that the basic formula for this car was still practically the same as it had ever been. Just like previous 911 models, this was a fairly compact, fairly lightweight vehicle with a pretty practical design. A front trunk, rear seats, and a car that wasn't too low or too aggressive for you to drive places. It could clear stuff in the front, you could park it, and you could drive it around, good visibility. It was sort of a practical, daily drivable sports car like the 911 had always been. And like previous 911s, it had a flat six, like I mentioned, rear mounted like other 911s, and the general design language of this car is very similar to other 911 models. If you factor out those headlights, the overall shape has a lot of 911 in it. And in fact, on early 996 models like this one, you can really see where the 993, the previous model, kind of evolved into this. It wasn't just a clean sheet, completely new car like a lot of enthusiasts will lead you to believe. There was a lot of design evolving, and you can really see that in this 996. And since we're talking about all this stuff, let's talk about the powertrain. Of course, in the back, you lift up the engine lid, the hood, I guess you could call it, and you can see the engine is really stuffed in here, just like it always has been in the 911, really pushed into the back of this car. This 996 uses a 3.4 liter flat six that made right around 300 horsepower, and that was true of all the early 996 models like this one. Later, Porsche facelifted the 996 for the 2002 model year, and those cars got a bigger engine, a 3.6 liter flat six that made about 320 horsepower. So a little more power, a little larger engine, and that was the basic reality of the 996 Carrera models throughout their lifespan. But anyway, let's move on to exterior quirks and features of this car, starting with the general design. Like I said, very sleek, very flowing lines. Porsche wanted to make this car the 911 of the new millennium, since it was just around the corner, and it really did that. It kind of took the regular 911 design, modernized it, made it look cool. The interesting thing about this 996 is that it has a rear wiper, which really kind of breaks up the sleek flowing lines in the back. This is actually a pretty unusual option. You did not often see a rear wiper. It was available. Most people didn't get it, but this car has it, making it a little bit more unusual than your typical 911. Another interesting thing that goes on back here, this one you might not notice, there's a rear spoiler this car has. You look in the back and you don't see it. That's because it's hidden until the car reaches a certain speed, and then the spoiler pops up automatically in back, in theory, to increase stability at higher speeds. But you don't have to wait to get up to higher speeds in order to pop up the spoiler. You can do it yourself with a very strangely placed button in the interior. The spoiler button is not in the center console, in the center control stack, with any electronics. Instead, it is this unlabeled button down in the driver's footwell. I believe this is the fuse box panel. You press this and that will raise up the spoiler if you want. They didn't make it easy to figure out how to raise the spoiler. I guess they didn't want people to do that very often and kind of look annoying driving around with their spoiler up, but you could do it. And if you wanted the spoiler down, you had to press and hold to confirm you wanted it down, to make sure there were no fingers under the spoiler that might get snapped. If you were pressing it, you were in control. But anyway, next up, since we're talking interior, let's, well, talk interior. Like I mentioned before, one of the criticisms of this car was that the interior had a little cheaper materials than previous 911 models, and that was certainly true. You could look around and see kind of some cheaper plastic. The panel gaps were a little bit bigger. It didn't quite look just as well put together as the interior in the 993, which was really a high quality piece. But one benefit of this car over previous 911 models, the interior had a little style. You had some curves in here. You had a few swoops, whereas previous 911s just had this sort of horizontal bar that was starting to get pretty outdated, even by the standards of very traditional 911 buyers. And so this was kind of Porsche's beginning of making the interiors a little bit more modern, a little bit kind of newer and nicer and hipper, which certainly is a trend that continues in 911 models today. Now, although we don't think of Porsche today as a small volume, quirky automaker, that was certainly their situation in the 1990s. And in fact, it was this car and its sibling, the Boxster, that really helped to kind of rise Porsche out of that small volume, nearly bankrupt, quirky automaker category and get them into sort of a more major player like they are today. But in the 90s, when this car was developed, they were still a small volume, quirky automaker, and that meant this car has some rather interesting interior quirks. For example, well, I already mentioned the location of the rear spoiler button, but how about the fact that this car does not have a glove box? None of the early 996 models had a glove box. So instead, they gave you a center console with a key lock, as you can see here. But weirder is the placement of the owner's manual. With no glove box, there was nowhere to put it. So Porsche created a little pouch under the steering column in the driver's footwell area that was sized perfectly to fit the owner's manual and nothing else. And so you had a locking compartment in the middle, you had the owner's manual pouch, but you didn't get a glove box. Very weird. And there's more weirdness in here. On the right side of the steering column, the right stalk controls the windshield wipers. As you can see, you can do the windshield washer and the wiper from here. Strangely enough, this stalk also controls the headlight washer, which you think doesn't really fit with the theme of the wiper stalk, but that's what it does. If you wanted to control the speed of the intermittent wipers, that had to be done with this dial in the center control stack. And then if you wanted to turn on the rear wiper, that had to be done with this switch on the other side of the center control stack that looked completely different. So the wiper controls were kind of spread out throughout the interior. And how about the climate controls? You can see it here. It's a fairly straightforward climate control system. The odd part is that when you have it in manual mode, you're manually adjusting the temperature and fan speed, not auto, the word manual shows up, but it's manuel with two L's and an E where an A should be. Porsche didn't bother to translate this into English for USA market cars. I guess they just figured, hey, it's close enough. This must have been the German word. They'll figure it out, so we'll just go with it. And that's the kind of quirky thing that a quirky small volume automaker would do. Now, there are a few things that I really do like in this interior. One is the door pocket storage situation. You have this front storage compartment where you can put stuff, but there's also a rear one that flips open so you can put stuff in it and hide it, which is kind of a cool idea. And it also doubles as an armrest. It's pretty nifty and pretty practical, like the 911 was in a lot of ways. In this particular 911, I also love the fact that the center tunnel, you can see, is painted green to match the exterior color. I'm not entirely sure if this was a factory green painted center tunnel or if it was done later, but it is really cool. This car has a rare and kind of special color, this rainforest green metallic, and the center tunnel bringing that into the interior also makes that kind of a special little treat when you're driving the car. One more thing that I love in this interior is the gauges right behind the steering wheel. You can see they are very no nonsense. In the center, you have the tachometer, not the speedometer. This was a racing vehicle, and so the tachometer was most important, although there was a digital speed readout right below that. But on the side, that sort of fans out and gives you progressively less important information, but all delivered directly to the driver. Big font, very clear gauges. Porsche was all about kind of no-nonsense, form over function, and this was a good example of that. And since we're inside, we should also turn our attention to the back seat. To get back here, you just push this latch on the side of the front seat, fold it forward, and then you can access the rear seats, which you can see are two individual bucket seats, one on each side, and they're pretty deep set buckets, which was kind of always characteristic of the 911. You certainly didn't have a middle seat. You had a big hump between the two seats, as you can see. Now, there's not much going on in these back seats. There really isn't. You don't have a lot of luxuries back here. You just had two seats, their seat belts, and that was basically it. In fact, the windows don't even roll down and back. That was limited only to the 911 Cabriolet, the convertible model. It had rear windows that rolled, but the coupe, you just kind of sat back there and that was all you did. Now, the rear seats do one interesting thing, which is that they can fold down, and on their seat backs, on the back side, is carpeting, which is interesting, and it's done for a reason. If you didn't want to use the rear seats for passengers, you would fold them down and have the seat back, the carpeted seat back, as a flat surface where you could put cargo. And you actually ended up with a pretty large cargo area back here, in addition to what you had in the front trunk. which I'll show you next. And in fact, the rear seat backs even have these little plastic pieces on the tops that would help stop cargo from sliding forward if you had it placed back here, so it wouldn't like come up into the front passenger compartment or fall between the seats. It's actually pretty well thought out, and again, adds some practicality to this car, which is kind of always a hallmark of the 911, especially compared to other less practical sports cars. And finally, we move on to the front trunk of the 996, which, as you can see, is fairly large and practical, which again, kind of a hallmark of the 911. Although there is one drawback to the front trunk practicality, and that's accessing it. There's no way on the key fob to access the front trunk. Later 911 models would get a button on the key fob for the front trunk, but you can see on this key fob, the only button is the lock-unlock button. You don't have a trunk button. So to get into the front trunk, you'd have to actually open up the driver's door. There was a latch in the door sill area. You'd pull on it, and that would open up the front trunk, and that was really your only access point. But once you're inside, it is fairly large. It is fairly practical, which is nice, and it contains a spare tire, which is unusual to see. I didn't realize 911s came with spare tires this late into production. Of course, later models, as the wheels started getting bigger, they couldn't fit the spare tire anymore. They would just give you a can of Fix-A-Flat and tell you good luck. But you do have a spare here. And interestingly enough, you also have this plastic piece which surrounds the brake fluid reservoir, and you can see on this plastic piece they've printed the word Porsche. In fact, the Porsche logo script is on there, which seems a little unnecessary to me, adds a little complication and expense, but they've decided to do that in case you're curious what you're driving when you're looking at the plastic trim around your brake fluid reservoir. It's kind of odd. Now, the other interesting thing worth pointing out up here, something a lot of Porsche people get into, is the little sticker on the inside of the front trunk. You can see this sticker here gives the VIN at the very top of the sticker, and then at the very bottom it gives the option codes that this car has, basically all of the options. And if you Google these option codes, you can figure out exactly what each one corresponds to know all of the original options that this car came with. These stickers were stuck under the hood on the production line in the factory, and still having your original sticker is a pretty big deal. Now, also on here, you can see the original color, L2A1, which stands for Rainforest Green Metallic, this rather unusual exterior color. And you can also see it says 996 110, and that was the version of this car. 996 was the version of 911 that this was, and 110 was the trim, the Carrera model, the base model. Other versions got different numbers. I think 996 120 was like a Carrera S, and then the 420 was the turbo, etc. And there were indeed quite a few variants of the 996. You also had a Targa with a glass roof that was pretty cool. You had an all-wheel drive version, the Carrera 4, the wide-body Carrera 4S. There was a convertible, a turbo, a GT2, a GT3. There was really a wide spread of different vehicles on the 996 generation. But this is the volume model, the big one, the one that most people got, the 911 Carrera. And now it's time to get behind the wheel and drive it. Do the thing that this car does the best. Drive it around. So let's do it. All right, driving the 996 Porsche 911. I love a good 996. I owned personally a 996 Turbo a long time ago, and I've reviewed several 996 models. I did a wide-body C4S, and I did a different turbo, but I've never done like a narrow-body regular 996 Carrera, and I'm excited to, and I love to get back into a 996, because the thing about the 996 that nobody ever talks about is that it drives fantastically. Everybody is so busy talking about how this car was the end of the line for the air-cooled in the original 911, and that the headlights have this shape that isn't as good, and the interior's not as nice, and there's all these reasons that Porsche purists use to justify why they don't like the 996. But what they never say, what nobody ever says is, oh, I don't like it because it doesn't drive well. And the reason for that is because it does drive well. The thing is, Porsche may have made some decisions based on, volume and in terms of the interior and modernity, in terms of the headlights that didn't really stick, but they always knew how to engineer a 911 to have it drive like a 911, and this car is such a great example of that. The first thing you realize when you get in this car, and one of this car's great assets, is the transmission. You have a very smooth and easy to operate clutch, and you have an absolutely wonderful shifter. The 996 shifter and clutch action is one of the very best of any car. The clutch is very nice, not quite as soft, I would say, as like an earlier 911, like a 993, but still very linear, very predictable, very easy to rev match because you know exactly where the bite point is pretty quickly. It is a very good clutch. But the thing that I really love is the shifter. The feel of the shifter and shifting gears is just so nice in this car. It almost feels like it's rotating around a ball. So when you're pushing it into first or third or fifth, it's sort of going up and over, and the lower gears, the 2, 4, 6 are down. And it's just like this perfectly weighted thing that falls beautifully into your hand. Now, there's actually a different shifter design that I like a little more that's a little thicker that came on the later cars, but this one will certainly do. And it just gives you this wonderful feeling when you drive the car of this connection to the car. Having a good manual transmission, shifter, and clutch gives you a connected feeling almost regardless of anything else about the car. However, this car doesn't need to be regardless of anything else about the car because the other stuff about the car is also excellent. The steering is just wonderful. It is so wonderfully predictable and precise and quick, and it does exactly what you want and goes exactly where you want. This car, for 25 years old, is really unbelievably tight in terms of steering and relatively precise. And I've got my 993 and I love my 993, but it's clear that there was an upgrade made to the 996. And a lot of the air-cooled guys don't want to recognize that to be true because they love their old school Porsches. And there is something nice about the feel of the older Porsches, but this car is definitely more of an athlete. It feels faster, it feels tighter, it feels, and the steering just feels so much more connected. It's clearly like the next generation car where they had made some leaps in technology and you just got a more precise, quicker steering experience compared to the older cars. And of course, since it's a 911, that means you have like a very, very good, very precise steering experience. It's just excellent. And then there's the powertrain. I love the Boxster. I love the 986 Boxster from this era. I think it has all the benefits I just described about the 996 911. However, the powertrain in the 911 quite clearly takes things to the next level in terms of performance. This car is fast. The Boxster doesn't necessarily feel fast. Even a Boxster S, it's quick enough, but it doesn't feel like fast. This car does. This car has like good power, and it feels quick, and it feels fast, and it feels like it's ready to go. More importantly, the powertrain is smooth, it's easy to operate, it's very predictable, it's very linear. It is just a very easy car to drive fast. And to me, that's everything. You have great steering, you have good handling, the car feels very well balanced, like you'd expect from a 911. You know, the 996 may have gone backwards in some arenas, and the air-cooled people would argue that to death, but it did not go backwards in terms of driving experience. At the end of the day, the great thing about this car is that it still drives like a 911. It's all just magical. You still have this amazing driving position that you get right in and feel like you know this car already. There are just so many wonderful positives about a 996 that outweigh, in my opinion, the complaints, particularly considering that this car is relatively affordable in part due to all the complaints. And I think that one of the distinctions between the air-cooled people and this is the air-cooled people want a car that drives great, but also they have a bit of an ego about not wanting the bad 911. People who get a 996 just want a car that drives great, and they understand that it's the cheap one and all that, but they just want to be drivers. And this car is for the drivers. It's the affordable one that maybe doesn't look as nice outside or inside, if that's your opinion. It's not mine, but some people's. However, it drives like a great Porsche 911. And one other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that I really firmly believe that the 996 is, to an extent, kind of the end of the line in terms of the small 911s. I love the 997, which came next. I love it dearly, and they did a great job of engineering it to feel small and feel tight. But that was sort of when it started to move into the territory of GT car, of luxury car, which obviously it firmly is in now with the 992. And I think that the 996 was the last one that felt like really analog, really tossable, really like a little sports car. And it's fast and it's fun, and there's a lot to love here. From a driving perspective, there really truly is. And so that's the 996 Porsche 911. I understand the enthusiast complaints. This definitely feels like a new generation of Porsche 911 compared to the older models that are so beloved. But new isn't always bad. This car still drives like a Porsche 911. That's a great thing, and it's a fantastic bargain. And you can get this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this 996 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 55 out of 100, which actually ties this car with the 993 Turbo, which was the higher performance version of its direct predecessor. The Turbo has a higher weekend score, and it is considerably more fun to drive, but it's hard to argue with the 996's daily benefits, especially its price point, which is a total value given its performance level and driving enjoyment. I'd still take the 993 Turbo, and in fact, I did, but if I was on a tighter budget, I'd get a 996, and I'd laugh at all the people who spend so much more on cars, not just the 993, but a lot of cars, when this 996 experience is available for such a reasonable amount of money.